Hello, good morning. This is Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Ansari, Department of Political Science, Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh. I will be talking today about parliamentary system, and in this parliamentary system, I will be talking about the Indian experience and Indian perspective about parliamentary system as a form of government. Now, the very first question that comes in mind when we talk about parliamentary system in India, that how India came to adopt this system, or what were the conditions responsible for adopting this form of government in India. Now, we need to keep in mind the fact that our colonial masters, the British, they had a parliamentary system in their country which was flourishing. So they introduced through different Government of India Act 1892, 1909, 1919, 1935, through these different Government of India Acts, they introduced this parliamentary form of government by and by. Besides, the Indian experience was such that it was looking for democratization of its society, and there was certain apprehensions about the presidential form which was considered to be too autocratic. So they basically, our constitutional mechanism and our fathers, those who were discussing about the suitability of either system, they found this parliamentary system to be the one which suits India's condition, where the parliamentarians or the ministers, they'll be accountable to the people directly through elections, and after getting elected, they'll be responsible to the legislature, which is the people's representative body. So these were basically two conditions and two reasons for adopting this form of parliamentary system in India. So besides that, we had this system as English system. It was quite significantly effective in the minds of constitution writers. So the parliamentary model, they knew that it will function to accommodate the diverse and numerous groups that make up the Indian nation. So as the founding fathers, they understood the necessity of accommodating different communities and their interests, and that was only possible through this form, which was the parliamentary. So additionally, the presidential form, it led to a confrontation between legislative and executive departments, which our newly independent nation could not afford. There are more parliamentary governments in the world at the time than the presidential form. So that was another factor which was weighing heavy on their minds, and especially in this structure, the legislative body normally has the final say and the administration is answerable to it. So that was another reason of accountability, and it was also referred to as responsible governance. So cabinet system of government, and the name which it came along with that, responsible and responsive government, that was the reason. So in independent India, the parliamentary form of government was adopted as the institutional device through which the democratic spirit was sought to be realized. The institutional setup is headed by president, who is the head of the state, and an executive functioned through the prime minister, who is the head of the government, and the judiciary by the Supreme Court, while the parliament is entrusted with the exercise of legislative powers. Now, these institutions function within the framework of parliamentary government based on the union of the legislative and executive wings of the government. The executive, the Council of Ministers, headed by the Prime Minister, comes from the legislature and is collectively responsible to it. In other words, it is through the members of parliament that the people of India exercised control over the executive. So these were some of the reasons, and that was the mechanism wherein we have in a parliamentary system one nominal head and one real head. So these difference of having two executive instead of one, so dual mechanism was suitable to Indian conditions, as one was directly responsible to the legislature and the other was in whose name the whole machinery was running. So if we talk about the main principles of the Indian version of parliamentary system, we find that this form was a one that was very much democratic, as it was having a popular check upon the government through the periodic elections, which was based on adult franchise. Then granting of liberties to its citizens was ensured through the constitution, and the presence of independent judiciary was safeguarding these independent rights as fundamental rights given to the people. The government is not irremovable, and it is periodically open for anybody who gets the support of the people and enters it as an individual or as a member of some party. So the individual is free to choose its way of entering the legislature, which was people's body. And the method of election is effected through persuasion and conversion and change of mind, change of opinion, performed through secret ballot. Moreover, the underlying assumption of our parliamentary democracy is the faith on liberal, democratic and individualistic principles. Now, the process of making this elaborate parliamentary structure functional, it depends upon the political parties. So, political parties came to play an important role, and here instead of having just two parties, we had the multi-party system. Now, these political parties, they constitute the crucial element in any parliamentary form of government. However, the presence of political parties of all hues and ideologies in the polity, sometimes with antagonistic and diverse conception of socio-economic order, renders the functioning of our parliamentary process sometimes difficult. Now, thus the question about the feasibility of parliamentary democracy in a country with no stable convention or rules to regulate the relationship between the various offices created by the Constitution, and the inability to function as a welfare state under the conditions of economic depravity are being increasingly raised from time to time. Now, these questions are being buttressed with proposals for alternative form of governments like the presidential system, replacing the cabinet form of government. However, we must remember that in choosing the Westminster model with some modifications, the framers of our constitution were motivated by the need for a responsible government to that of a stable government to be found in the presidential system of government. Now, our experience during the colonial days was such that something that was autocratic or dictatorial was to be avoided, and the spirit of democracy, wherein the people directly participated in decision making through their representatives, that was what was hovering heavy on the minds of the people, and the representatives, especially the constitution makers. So that was the reason why these main principles were adopted with some modifications. Now, the governments depend on parliamentary majority, and that makes it incumbent upon the parliamentary government to be responsible in its functions. Now, in our parliamentary democracy, the parliament plays a vital deliberative role as a forum for national debate, thereby constituting a popular check upon governmental authority and functions. The individual members of parliament and the opposition during question hour, amendment processes and general debate, they have amply demonstrated the deliberative importance of the parliament. Furthermore, the restraint upon the government activities and policies is maintained through the introduction of no confidence motion, cut motions, adjournment motion, or calling attention motions. Now, thus a popular authority of the parliament in our political system is reinforced through the continuous and periodic assessment of governmental responsibilities. Now, this assessment is a continuous process, and it is done through the different procedures which are adopted in the parliament and periodically by people during general elections. Now, this is something unlike the feature in presidential system, where this assessment is only periodic and is limited by the tenure of the executive, making the legislature literally ineffective during normal times. Thus, any assessment of the effectiveness of our parliamentary system must take into cognizance the wishes of the framers of the constitution, their values and the responsibility with which they framed this constitution, and that was the imposition of or infusion of the democratic spirit among the people. So, the parliamentary structure has also been replicated at the level of the states that respected this autonomy and the federal spirit that legitimizes the union of the union of the country. Now, since India adopted this parliamentary system, the state governments were also obliged through the constitution to adopt the similar mechanism of governance. Consequently, at the level of the states, we have elaborate structures that pursue the parliamentary spirit in choosing their leaders and administering government activities. By adoption of parliamentary system to the requirement of large federal states means that the legislative power of the parliament are limited. Now, since the federal and the state governments have separate lawmaking authority that is derived from the constitution, the Indian situation is characterized by constitutional supremacy rather than parliamentary supremacy, which is what the modification in this parliamentary system is. Because in India, we don't have supremacy of parliament, but it is the constitution through which all the parliamentary and other constitutional bodies drive their power. So, the supremacy of constitution is further reinforced by constitutional provision of granting fundamental rights and empowering the judiciary with the power to act as a custodian of these rights. Now, in short, our parliamentary democracy, the legitimacy to rule is vested in the parliament, which it derives from the willing consent of the people who make up the electorate. It is the collective personality of the parliament that imposes a code upon the conduct of both individuals and political parties. The parliament is the protector of individual liberty and the foundation of Indian law as well. Now, talking about the features of Indian parliamentary system, we find that in the other parliamentary democracies, in comparison, is that it is clearly demarcates the positions and powers of the head of the state and head of the government, thereby, in a sense, establishing dual executives. The head of the government is appointed from the party or a coalition of parties that enjoy majority in parliamentary seats. Now, this council of ministers headed by the Prime Minister is collectively responsible to the parliament. Now, this principle of collective responsibility, it puts the idea of accountability in the government and it restricts governments from taking decisions that it cannot justify before the parliament. Now, this does not indicate that the hallmark of parliamentary system is a government that is collective, but also implies that executive powers are collegiate in nature, helping the maintenance of pluralism of opinions that forms the bulwark against authoritarianism. Moreover, unlike the Westminster model, the head of the state in India is elected and exercises his power within the express provision of the constitution. He is also not merely a tutelar head. The constitution empowers the parliament to impeach the president on a violation of the constitution. Now, this implies that the president is empowered to discharge certain functions on his own for which he is liable. Now, the president is also an integral part of the parliament and is vested with powers by the constitution that helps to check parliamentary impropriety in case of inability of political parties to secure parliamentary majority or its loss at any given time. Now, if you look at the constitutional provision of the parliamentary system, we find that in the Indian parliamentary system, as in other parliamentary system, the government governs in and through the parliament, thereby infusing the legislative and executive branches together in the spirit of parliamentary democracy. The Indian Constitution in Article 75(5) emphasizes this peculiar fusion by maintaining that if a minister is not a member of any house within a period of 6 months, he shall cease to be a minister. In other words, only a member of parliament, which is the legislative body, can become a minister of the government or a member of the executive. The Council of Ministers is therefore said to be the hyphen that links the legislative branch of the state to the executive branch. In a parliamentary system, which is sometimes referred to as prime ministerial form or cabinet form of government, the cabinet, comprising of a few leading ministers headed by the prime minister, makes all important decisions. The members of the cabinet are allowed to play important political roles in rendering policy directives, but under the overall supervision and authority of the prime minister. The constitutional provision for parliamentary government in India, there are basically 4 provisions for the parliamentary form of government in the Constitution of India, which are Article 74. Now, Article 74 focuses on the assistance and counsel provided by the Cabinet of Ministers to the President in carrying out his duties. Secondly, if the President requests that the Cabinet of Ministers reconsider, then the revised advice should be followed. Thirdly, the Council of Ministers' recommendations to the President are not subject to judicial review. Then next is Article 75. Now, Article 75 covers that the minister is chosen, especially the Prime Minister, is chosen by the President, and the President chooses other ministers based on the Prime Minister's recommendations. Secondly, for the duration of President's time in office, ministers are selected by the President. Thirdly, the Cabinet of Ministers is collectively accountable to the Lok Sabha. Then there is another article, Article 163, which focuses on the assistance and counsel provided by the Cabinet of Ministers to the Governor as he performs his duties. Now, this provision is at the state level, where now the President's role is being conducted by the Governor, that is, seeing that the government is run on the basis of the Constitution. So, the assistance and counsel of the Ministerial Council are not required if the Governor is operating as his or his own discretion. The Council of Ministers' recommendations to the Governor are not subject to judicial review. Then Article 164, it covers with the following, that the Chief Minister is appointed by the Governor, who also names other ministers at the Chief Minister's recommendation. Then for the length of Governor's time in office, ministers are selected by the Governor. And the state's Legislative Assembly hold the ministers jointly liable for their activities and actions. Now, if you look at the advantages that this parliamentary system has brought in Indian context, we find that the better functioning between the executive and legislature is ensured by this mechanism of parliamentary democracy. Since the executive is a component of the legislature, and the majority of lawmakers often support the government, so passing legislation and putting them into effect is made much easier. Then secondly, this mechanism has prevented authoritarianism, as the body, that is legislature, is in charge of the executive and has the power to remove it through a motion of no confidence. Authoritarianism is fully avoided. Furthermore, the power is not centralized like it is under the presidential form of government. Third advantage that can be seen is the government is responsible, because the legislators have the power to interrogate the executive branches. They can debate issues of public concern, they can apply pressure to follow what is in public interest, so the executive's action are subject to scrutiny by the Parliament at every instance through different motions which are conducted in the Parliament, which makes the executive remain responsible to the masses and through the Parliament. Then another advantage is that it represents different groups. Now, under this arrangement, Parliament provides various national groups with representation. Now, this is particularly significant for a nation like India, wherein we find number of different communities of different faith and different persuasions, they stay in the country. So they get appropriate representation in the parliament, and that helps in satisfying their concerns and also cooperating and coordinating with the system. Now, this system has also brought in its fold flexibility. So the system is flexible because it is simple to replace the Prime Minister when necessary. As can be seen in the example that Winston Churchill succeeded Chamberlain as Prime Minister of Great Britain during the period of Second World War with ease. Now, contrary to presidential system, where a president can only be removed at the end of his or her tenure or in the event of impeachment or any kind of disability in the midterm. Now, when we look at the demerits, we find that in spite of many practical merits of the system, some objections have been urged against it. Now, it has been argued that the parliamentary system violates the theory of separation of power, and accordingly it cannot commend itself, it cannot praise itself. So combination of executive and legislative functions in the same set of individual leads to some sort of tyranny. Now, Sidgwick says, while admitting that the undeniable gain of harmony between these two chief organs of government maintains that it is to be purchased by serious drawbacks. Ministers, he says, are liable to be distracted from their executive duties by the work of preparing legislative measures and carrying them through the parliament, which, while parliament is tempted away from legislative problems by interesting questions of current administration, in which, especially in foreign affairs, it's liable to interfere to an excessive extent. Now, the advantage of division of government into different departments are thus lost in the fusion or the confusion of legislative and an executive function. Now, this criticism, however, does not seem to be valid. Practical experience tells us that collaboration between the executive and the legislative powers is essential for the well-being of the state. Now, these departments cannot be divided into watertight compartments. The theory of the separation of power in its traditional and consequently rigid form is inconceivable and inoperative, because the need of the situation and the demand for the law is made by one body, and the other body, that is legislature, which makes it, may not feel the urgency of that law. So in that bargain, a situation arises which leads to a kind of conflict between the two organs of the same government, which is not suitable for a country's welfare and well-being. Then it is further pointed out that parliamentary system is unstable because the government has no fixed term. It remains in office only as long as it can retain parliamentary majority, which is subject to the vagaries of representatives, particularly if the dominant party in the representative chamber is either small or wanting in cohesion. So in the case where it is wanting in cohesion, it's also liable to be upset by a new combination of parties in the chamber, aided perhaps by personal intrigues, if the opportunity for combination is skillfully chosen so that the newly formed majority is not reversed on an appeal to the country. So that creates a situation of uncertainty. A party in power always looks at its back to see that the other ministers are following it, because they may liable to change their loyalties and join some other party which is offering them some better cushion or cushy post or some other benefits in the form of monetary. So the uncertainty in the tenure of office, the critics maintain, provides no incentive to the party in power to adopt a far-sighted and consistent policy, nor does it venture to embark upon durable projects. A new minister which assumes office is sure to reverse the policy of the defeated ministry, for it comes in with its own definite policy and program. It may, however, be said that much of the above criticism is true only in countries with multiple political parties, where the lease of life of the cabinet is short and precarious. Countries like Great Britain, having a dual party system in practice, do not demonstrate such a state of affairs, as dual party system is really the true basis of parliamentary democracy. Then it is sometimes deplored that the cabinet system divides the country into two antagonistic sets of men, those who strive their utmost to get things done and those who do their utmost to obstruct it. So the opposition under the cabinet government must oppose tooth and nail all measures sponsored by the government, irrespective of their practical utility. Now sometimes a government policy is subjected to such a scathing criticism that it proves detrimental to the national solidarity and prestige. When opposition indiscriminately opposes what the government may say or propose, it retards the progress of the country, and it also amounts to national wastage, both of money and time. So the antagonism between the parties is not confined to legislature alone. They keep the country in a spirit of commotion and turmoil. As Bryce points out, the system of parliamentary form intensifies the spirit of party and keeps it always on the boil. Even if there are no important issue of policy before the nation, there are always the office to be fought for. One party holds them, the other desires them, and the conflict is unending, for immediately after a defeat, the beaten party begins its campaign to dislodge the victors. It is like the incessant battle described as going on in the blood vessel between the red corpuscles and the other microbes. So it is a war that is always there, if not in reality, it's going on in the minds and behind their back. So it keeps them always busy in the kind of a conflict to capture the power in the country. Then another demerit of the system is said to be that of inefficient rule, because it is a government by amateurs and there are no experts involved in ministries. The headship of different departments of the government is entrusted to persons who may not be familiar even with the rudiments of administration. A youth must pass an examination in arithmetic before he can hold a second-class clerkship in a treasury, but a chancellor of the exchequer may be a middle-aged man of the world who has forgotten what little he has ever learned about figures at Eton or Oxford, and is innocently anxious to know the meaning of those first little dots when confronted with treasury accounts worked out in decimals. Now that is the situation, that is the reality of a minister who comes to occupy a ministerial responsibility in the parliamentary system. And Disraeli, while forming a ministry, offered the Board of Trade to a man who wanted instead the local government board. Now it does not matter, said Disraeli. I suppose you know as much about trade as the First Lord of Admiralty knows about the ships. So the Prime Minister is not concerned in the choice of ministers with their aptitudes and knowledge of the department they have to preside over. His choice is seriously limited by political considerations, the foremost of which is the preservation of a stable parliamentary majority. Hence, the amateur who obtains office is not always a gifted amateur. Weak men, incompetents, are sometimes appointed to office or to inappropriate departments out of such consideration of popularity, sometimes gained or faded a decade or more ago, or through the personal esteem or friendship of Prime Minister. Either way, it leads to inefficiency in the functioning of the department. Then further, another allegation is that it's a system which is ever growing in size. That is, the cabinet is ever growing to accommodate different interests and different constituencies in the government formation. So cabinets have grown everywhere, too large for prompt and effective discussion, and decision. So huge amount of work to be done with the cabinet and the tremendous burden on each minister departmentally, parliamentarily, then electorally and socially. Now this leaves very little margin of time for serious thought on any subject beyond the immediate task. So considering vast expansion in the activities of the state and other political compulsions of a parliamentary system of government, the parliamentary system, its critics maintain, has degenerated into a party government in which political power is monopolized by the majority party. So long as this parliamentary majority is assured, it assumes dictatorial powers. The minority party is completely left out of active participation in the government, and the nation is deprived of the talented persons who might be belonging to the minority party. Then there is also lack of promptness. Now this is the charge on the parliamentary system, that there is no emergency kind of a situation felt and shown in the behavior of the ministers. Because a cabinet consists of large number of ministries which need many minds to be consulted. So a quick and decisive opinion cannot accordingly be secured. Moreover, a candidate under the parliamentary system with its divided responsibility, open discussions and shifting majority can hardly be expected to take prompt, united and vigorous decisions. Now these objections are also borne by the facts, and World War II had immensely demonstrated the cabinet government how it can withstand the test of time. And India too, there is cabinet government both in the center and the state. How successfully the central and the state governments grappled with the problems of refugees and problems of day-to-day, especially after partition, is now a matter of contemporary history. And we have seen how they have failed in performing the duties with promptness which was expected. So there is another charge, and that is a very important charge, that is of cabinet dictatorship. And it is said that it is alleged that small body of men with backing of solid majority in the legislature care little for the will of the legislatures and wishes of the electorate. So the firm control of the cabinet over the legislature, it enables the cabinet to pass laws of its own choice and obstruct the passage of the measures which it does not like. So public opinion has no opportunity or power to bring its effect or pressure to bear on the legislation. Thus it is sometimes charged that Great Britain practices a form of plebiscite democracy in which people vote yes or no on the record of the government in general, but are deprived of any share in the formulation of individual policies. Now, in the case of India, presently we find that kind of dictatorship wherein the thumping majority of one party can lead to taking decisions which Parliament may not like, or the opposition in Parliament may not like those, and no discussions are being conducted on those points especially which are in the welfare of the country or welfare of the whole community. So the extent to which a cabinet in practice abuses power depends on the presence or absence of suitable checks on its operations. So an unrestrained cabinet is apt to be a despot, but public awareness of this danger may well arrest such development. So finally, the charge has to be taken by the public through the elections to ensure that such cabinet dictatorship can be checked at the earliest before the damage could be done. Now, that was the form of parliamentary system that we have in India, and it has been working and working well, although demands are raised for converting this parliamentary system into presidential form, but then the accommodation of various interests through the parliament of these different communities which are called the Indian is important, and that can only be ensured in this form, that is the parliamentary form. And it has, and its working has shown that India is well equipped to have this system, the parliamentary system. People have well adopted to it, and time has shown that the people have risen themselves to the requirement of the situation, as during the days of emergency when the people, through this power of the vote, they threw the government which was dictatorial or wanted to impose emergency and wanted to deprive the people of their right and democracy. So the public awareness and public vigilance is the final assurance of all kinds of rights, liberties, and also the democracy. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you.